So, as we delve through the dark corners of my role-playing game connection, we find ourselves at Tales of Gargentihr. So, while steampunk might be all the rage now, it was around before, and there's aspects of Tales of Gargentihr which are steampunky. You need only look at the styling of the title and the imagery that's been selected to see that. So there was kind of this previous wave of steampunkian ideas. Space 1889, perhaps more Vernsian than anything else. And then there was Castle Falkenstein, or Falkenstein, depending which universe you're from. There was this. There were a few other games here and there, Victoriana later on. There isn't really a pure steampunk RPG, which is a gap in the market I keep intending to fill, but I've only got so many hours in the day. They all tend to mix something else with it. Victoriana is basically Victorian Shadowrun. Keep your elves out of my steampunk and my cyberpunk. Thank you very much. Castle Falkenstein did kind of the same thing. Tales of Gargentihr is an entire alternate world. Now, we've talked about fantasy heartbreakers before, which is where people just clone D&D. But there is an advantage to doing that, in that there is an already established audience that likes that kind of thing, and in that it's familiar. The very thing that pisses me off about fantasy heartbreakers is also what can make a lot of them quite viable. I mean, Pathfinder is basically a fantasy heartbreaker that succeeded due to an unpopular edition of D&D. But yeah, it is easy to go too far the other way, to stray into the sake of being bizarre for bizarre's sake, and the lack of familiarity, the inability that a lot of people have to latch on to games like that, like Tales of Gargentihr, like Mechanical Dream, is that it's just too alien. Those games often tend to get a very tight and interested audience, as Empire of the Petal Throne has done, and a few others. But still, now, Tales of Gargentihr is one of those overly weird games. I'm using the skull. It's not just an Aurini skull. It'll help me keep the pages in. Tales of Gargentihr is one of those games that is kind of strange for strange's sake, and was one part of the kind of mini boom of games in the 90s in the UK, like SLA Industries and so on, and another one from Scotland. And as you can see, the binding is not great. I'm pretty sure they used the same printer that SLA Industries did for its notoriously page-exploding first edition. But yeah, there was this kind of mini boom of British games in the 90s. I guess this and Blood and SLA Industries. God, this is going to fall apart as I look at it, isn't it? Oh well. Oh yeah, so it's weird. I don't remember a huge amount about it, particularly the system. So I'm going to be kind of reminding myself as we go through. The desktop publishing is slightly primitive. The printing, you can see the pixelization in a lot of the pictures. So, you can tell these were noobs. I did try and track them down so that I could get a license to do a new edition of this, because I don't know, I kind of like doing that for games. I did it for Blood. I'd really like to do it for this. They weren't interested. They were squatting on the license, and they were now all doing, I think it was real estate or solicitor's office or something. There's obvious allusions to America and colonialism and so on, right from the dating 1492. The whole world is predicated on a bunch of weird ideas put together. So the islands and the continents and everything on the world of Tales of Gargentihr float on a sea of silt, so they're constantly moving. And while there are ships and things that might move through the silt, while there are airships and things later on we'll see that may travel, geography isn't static. And so when continents or islands hit together, people can move from one to the other, create settlements and so on, and then when they move apart, the cultures diverge and so on. So that's kind of really important to this. And this game is set after a continent of kind of baseline humans. I think they're called the Caro. Collided with another continent and settled it. So you can view that like 1492, the settlement of the Americas. Only none of the cultures are really quite like that. And yeah, so you've got this colony on this new continent that is not hugely explored yet. They're learning their way around it. So you've got the usual stuff. What is an RPG? How to play? Got some artwork. Pretty bog standard for the 90s. Kind of artwork there. Usual stuff about how to roleplay. The concepts of Gargentihr. This is important. It's a good thing they put it. They put it up front. So the energy force, the kind of magic that drives the world, is called Sa, and that falls from the sky in Sa storms and Sa rains and lightning bolts and so on. And that basically empowers the magic around the world. Particularly the magic of the chiromancers, who we'll get to in a bit. So there's an environmentalist angle to it, which is kind of looking ahead, considering this was, 94, 95? 94, okay, got it, just about right. So that's important. The Darklands is this mystical place that exists alongside the world. It's kind of like a spirit realm that belief-powered magic taps into more than Sa. So that's interesting. That didn't really come up in the game. I think it was meant to come up more in supplements and so on. The seas, as we covered, are silt, kind of thick quicksand substance. You can go over it on this kind of skid ships, but there are monsters and all kinds of horrible things out there. When the continents get close, the silt gets compressed and you can walk along it for a while, but that's rare. This whole idea of the continents moving was quite good for coming up with adventures, because you could just have an island drift into reach with all kinds of weirdness on it, and they didn't need to be connected to your main campaign if you wanted to do something more. And the continents are just enormous versions of the islands, drifting at about 5 miles an hour per year. So yeah, that gives you some sort of idea of how this all works. So it goes into some of the continents, some history of the world. There's lots of races, and they're all quite weird, apart from the human-like ones. They're interesting. Some of them may not have passed muster in today's politically correct atmosphere, since they feel a bit like stereotypes of genuine races. There's technology, but it's a bit weird, bit odd. Church disapproves of it. So you've got a fairly fanatical Church of Scientology, with witch hunters and so on that disapprove of non-approved religions. The locals, the natives of the continent that the colonization effort is happening on, they have their own religion where they worship spirits and so on. And adventurers have a hook. Now, this is a good thing that you often don't see explicitly put out in games, but the Clondis or Clondis, or however the heck you pronounce it, that's a big problem with this game. Names for things, weird names for things, but they're basically an adventurers guild that accept anyone honourable, and they accept tasks. We've got a map of the continent that the game ostensibly takes place on. And there's an honour mechanic, which was interesting. That kind of encourages you to do heroic things and to behave in heroic ways according to the culture, and that's almost more important than wealth and so on. So there's intrigue in the civilized areas, which is meant to be the focus of the campaign there, and then there's exploration and discovery and so on. So it's divided up into different lands and different peoples. Don't need to go into huge detail there. It's the usual kind of thing. Some of the illustrations are interesting, but a bit odd and weird. Be interested to see what happened to the artists who worked on this and how their style has developed, whether they kept it up or not. So we got a region guide, talks about the various people. A race obviously ripped off from Dark Crystal. Nothing wrong with that. Timeline. More information on the Adventurers Guild. So they're basically adventurous mercenaries for hire, but with a sense of honour and protecting the little people and all that sort of thing. They have their own halls, their own symbols and languages, and so on. AC is adventurer character. I think that's the other thing. So everyone seems to want to impose their own terminology on a game. I think that reached its apex with the Hollyhock God. Not in this game, in an entirely different one, but Nobly, or Noblins, as one of my friends used to call it. So let's see, character creation: fighter, scholar, rogue, or mystic. That's quite good. That's fairly broad character types that you can be. Let's see, any unusual statistics: strength, health, agility, manipulation. Okay, so that's manual tasks. Stealth as a statistic, that's a little unusual. That was used in Dragon Warriors, but I don't think we see it that often. Combat as its own statistic, that's interesting. Senses, knowledge, Kai is your spiritual ability. And Dal is Dal Shra, which is your connection to the magical energy. So that's the kind of divide between, if you like, arcane and divine, if you want to put it in D&D terms. You roll d20, whether your stats are favoured or slighted, and that gives you a rating between 1 and 10, basically. So a little bit of an odd character creation. Races: the Karo are kind of standard humans. The Haesh are semi-barbaric, I guess, but spiritually connected. You know, that old set of tropes. They kind of look like Chinese or Japanese, but also there's aspects of their culture that's more Native American. One good thing about the game is that its cultures are all kind of hang together and make sense, and they have their own thing. You got to roll character backgrounds depending where your family was from. That was interesting, gave you a bit of a life path thing. And your character developed through terms, so you went through a period of years and events with things happening to you as you went along. So it's a kind of a life path system, which we first saw in Cyberpunk. So that was always good. You came out of character creation with an idea of who your character was and why, and maybe developed in different ways than you initially set out to create. So that was good. The energy bar is a pretty big, complicated version of a health track. It kind of reminds me of Cyberpunk's wound levels, Cyberpunk 2020's wound levels, but yeah, that was a bit of a sticking point. It was a bit tricky to keep track of. Let's see, initiative, damage, all kinds of derived statistics there. Travelling events, depending where and what, so that gave you some adventure hooks and things. Event encounters, characteristics of people. These kind of tables are actually really useful for other games, and if the book hadn't been so fragile, I may have used it for other things. But yeah, as you go through the events and you develop over time, you gain bonuses and abilities or extra money or whatever else. So the life path was actually, really good. You had careers, this kind of stuff, this aspect. It's kind of like old edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So you could go through different apprenticeships and occupations. These would give you access to different skills and so on. It's long and involved. It's not something you can just toss off, so that's good and bad. If you want to do in-depth NPCs, it's going to take you a while. If you want to just quickly pick up the game and get a game running straight away, you're going to need pre-gens. It's not really going to work otherwise. See, weird names for things. Danger is an entertainer / rogue / thief, I guess. Eesh. Yeah, the civilized humans that have arrived have professorships, doctorships, and so on, so you can become a doctor, a fellow of geography, a new scientist, historian, all kinds of things like that. Now, here we get to something really interesting. The chiromancers. They manipulate and use the Tsar energy, so they get access to more energy when the Tsar is strong, when it's raining from the skies and the lightning bolts are crackling down, and they can store it and use it. But they're all suffering from a disease called Dice Syndrome, which causes them to slowly fade out of reality. So they have implants and devices and so on that stop them doing that. You can kind of look at them as a cross between Hellraiser's Pinhead and other Angels of Pain, and the undead creatures from Dark City, kind of, only with magic. So, and the magic you have access to depends on the items that are built into you and all the ones that you carry. So it's quite a commitment to be that kind of magic user. Whereas if you want to be a mystic or something similar, it's little less of a commitment, but you're more likely to fall afoul of witch hunters and so on. Chiromancers get a pass. Silt Reavers are basically pirates, footpads, cops, essentially, and all sorts. So then you got skills, which also go from 1 to 10. So you got stat 1 to 10, skill 1 to 10. How difficult are things, what you need to roll, and so on. You know, standard sort of stuff. The combat, I seem to remember being quite fluid and quite deadly in a lot of ways. But there wasn't really anything that really makes it stand out to me. The big standout quality of the game was in its weird setting and the character generation, the in-depth character generation. Which I really liked. So there's nothing hugely interesting there to look at. Combat, yeah, it's fairly swift, fairly deadly. This was nice, like an illustration of how it goes and describing it all. Yeah, a lot more combat sections could do with doing that. I'm thinking about doing a collaborative webcomic project. Similar to the kind of cartoon descriptions you see there, or the ones you saw in the old Dragon Warriors, where you explain the mechanics and so on visually through a story aid. I think that would be a good way to do it. I just need to find someone I can work with to do that. I'm talking to someone, but we'll see. Oh, blood loss. Yeah, there's a lot of mechanical additions and so on that you have to keep track of. I mean, that happens in every game. It ends up getting bloated out, but yeah, blood loss. That's a feature in a horror game like Blood, but in this it feels like a bit of a needless addition, unless you're really into simulation. Riding mounts called skinks. It reminds me of Gore a bit. They have Thalarian to ride there. All the usual stuff there. You know, rules pretty much covers the same sort of stuff that you usually do. Game mechanics reiterated and explained in shorter form, which is always nice for reference. So you got that there. Falling, asphyxiation, poison, all the rest of it. Diseases, some interesting ones there. Char skin. Causes your skin to dry and crack and flake away by causing you not to produce skin oil anymore, which is lovely. The honor rules there. So there's different honor codes, but the honor within the Adventurers Guild is much more set, and it affects your reputation, helps you project what kind of person you are to others, and so on. There's the code of the Clondis. Protect the innocent and those in need. Uphold the secrecy of the Clondis. Serve your Clon Hall to the best of your abilities. Safeguard your Shevin at all times. Never forget your brothers and put their needs before your own. Shevin is the group, I guess. Compete with other Shevin for work, but never betray or kill a fellow clon. Never refuse a job worthy of your attention. Work with passion and honour at all times. Sign your mark after every job. Let no imposter use your mark, lest he damages the reputation of all. So that, you know, there's some plot hooks and so on there. And you can earn favours from the Clondis and so on. You know, rules for fear and insanity. Quite what they're doing there, I don't know. Then the chiromancy. So yeah, the disease that causes them to phase in and out of reality, and they can also activate that if they want. And so, yeah, it causes them to fade into the spiritual realm more and more over time. Chiroware is this kind of cyberware implants and devices and so on. Let's see, where's the actual chiroware? Yeah, you get SAR points more or less depending on the weather. So weather was a really important thing in this for a whole bunch of reasons. But yeah, in some ways, the kind of interplay of devices and magic for chiromancers is somewhat similar to the way the magical devices that the Magitech works in Iron Kingdoms. It all interconnects and affects each other. So you need to gather and produce SAR in order to use it in order to boost the things that you have in. So we've got adrenal plugs, basically a reflex booster like in Cyberpunk. Cardiac resistor. Pumps attached to your heart via tubing from your chirosuit, which is the thing that keeps you in reality. So it lets you divert fatigue into your suit. Scanners, disruptors, so you can, you know, punch people and channel energy into them. Transformer, which lets you phase in and out of the fade. More energy capacitors. You know, suddenly your fantasy game has all kinds of cyberware kind of thrown into it. Which, yeah, nothing wrong with that. It's quite interesting and different. Then there's the belief magic, which is less powerful but safer to use. Doesn't require as much of a personal sacrifice in terms of getting stuff plugged into your body, but does run into witch hunters, which, you know, is less good, unless you're a member of the church, of course. Herbs were quite important and powerful in this, and you could put them together in all kinds of different ways. So we've got all sorts of stuff there. Then we've got other races. So we've got a cat race. What did I say about names? What is that? Kintifar? Kintifar? Chintefar? Who knows? But they're cat people. So we got them. The Haesh are the local natives. I think we talked about them before, so we don't particularly need to talk about them. The Jahansh are the ones that look like the creatures from Dark Crystal. They're kind of old and mystical, and they go through a metamorphosis to it's not exactly to reproduce, but to become a different versions. There's kind of two races in one. So you've got the Jahansh and the Jakan, who emerge after they go through this transformational process, this like a butterfly in a chrysalis. And these are much more combative and energetic and yeah, ravaging. This is a good way to put them, I guess. The Juke are probably the race that you wouldn't be able to get away with in the current age, because they're kind of these immensely tall, immensely strong, very black men, I guess you could say, with kind of exaggerated racialized features. I imagine people would pitch a fit about them today. They're also not very nice people. They keep slaves and are quite expansionist and dangerous. Caro, basic humans. The The Kostra are your kind of inscrutable Oriental stereotype, I guess. They all have these moon-shaped heads. Masters of poison, if I remember correctly. And very class and house oriented, very deeply into their manners, their etiquette. Kind of aloof, suspicious, difficult to read sort of thing. So yeah, they're interesting. The Murdal are rock people, trolls, golems, that sort of thing. Mostly live underground, but have begun to emerge out into the world at large. Roquan, I barely remember. Kind of odd looking. Don't know. No, I don't remember enough about them to say anything. Family based. Specialist branch merchants. Maybe they're a travelling race. The Riamis are interesting. They're kind of bat people, but giving a race. I mean, if you let players play a Riamis, which you couldn't actually make someone play any of these alternate races under the base rules. Maybe you would have in an expansion. But having a player race that can fly is not the best. Yeah, so they can actually fly via their wings, which is not a good thing to give access to a player character, but as an NPC, that's fine. They're always filthy with lice and flies and things following them around, which is, also lovely. They live in the mountains. Yeah, they rarely bathe, and the Val keep their bodies clean. I'm not sure what the Val is. I think that's servants or a pet or something. Yeah, so they're kind of tribal people, if I'm remembering right. The Shashen, this was interesting, and an idea which I've thought about incorporating into other games, but the Shashen may not even be a race. They may just be aspects of this great forest that is constantly growing and expanding and taking over more and more land and being battled by people, but it will occasionally form things, monsters, plant people, whatever you want to call it, and sending them out into the world to interact with others or to fight and invade. So it's just like this pure organic hive intelligence almost that's constantly moving. It's just something that's really interesting. Wind Traders are kind of aloof, mysterious race that flies around on these giant creatures and trades between continents. So they're a good way of introducing weirdness or new races or whatever else you wanted to. Got monsters. The usual problem that you have in fantasy games of having too many intelligent monsters. There's a whole bunch of other strange stuff that they have too. Weird mounts, insects and lizards and so on. Abstract things that come across from the Darklands. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty standard fare for the most part. Just slightly odd. No weirder than Dark Sun, shall we say. Because the base campaign takes place in the civilized areas, there's a fairly big section on politics, the interplay between society. So the Church of Sanctology is the only sanctioned mystical religious magic. So if you're anything else, you're screwed. Chiromancers are strictly controlled. The idea of these institutes, these universities, is one thing that's really interesting. So you got an institute of law if you wanted to play a law enforcer, martial studies for soldiers, medicine if you wanted to be a doctor, the new science if you wanted to explore new and interesting stuff, the Institute of Chiromancy, just the way that the civilized society is organized along these lines. It really encourages you to think of the adventure in a colonial way, in a discovery and enforcement and a taming of the world around you. And that definitely drove a lot of the feel behind the game. There's a lot of detail for this weird world, and that works against the game as much as it does anything else, because there's a lot to learn. And this goes back to the point I was making earlier about how strange games are interesting, but there's just so much you have to learn and know. There's no common understanding through the whole thing. I mean, everyone knows what an elf is like, what a dwarf is like, because there's this common language that comes from D&D and Lord of the Rings and all the rest of it. You know, people can easily pick up on that kind of thing. Whereas here you've got everything's weird. The currency, the names, the races, everything's new, and it's an awful lot to take in and absorb to run the game or to play the game. You know, it's hard to understand how your character fits into a world that just you're completely unfamiliar with. I mean, people ask why societies and things aren't more different in a lot of fantasy novels. Why in Game of Thrones, for example, you've got dragons and whatever else, but the human societies are all, you know, based on historical interactions. It's all completely believable. There's nothing new or weird or different about them. Well, that's why you need people to be able to understand and latch on to what you're doing. For people like me, novelty like Tales of Gargentihr is great, but you know, I'm entrenched in nerd media. I'm interested in the new. I get overexcited about new and different, but for a lot of people, they are perfectly happy with something familiar. And the sheer amount of learning you have to do, not just the system, but the setting and everything else. You know, you can't just throw together an elf, a dwarf, a human, and a halfling and go exploring a dungeon. You have to think, you know, and it's a lot more effort. Oh, they had like a force field technology called a Skichan web, which is reminded me of Dune a lot. The force fields in Dune, the slow blade penetrates the shield, all that business. And actually, thinking about it, there is a lot of a kind of atmosphere of Dune about this. Maybe that's another influence, that the navigators on the chiromancers. We got all kinds of weird swords, different bolts, rock pipes are the guns in this. So there's this special material that they make the guns out of, and then you light a pan under it, and the rapid change in heat causes something to happen and to shoot a bullet, but they're only like one shot. So we were talking about 16th, 17th century equivalent technology for the most part. But then you get all this weirder stuff. The new scientists, the new science stuff. Blades and rods and grapples and things, which are much more advanced than the guns. So that's interesting. There's the mounts and stuff again. Consumables and services. Too many games leave out that kind of information. Damn you. And then we got, every game has to give you advice on how to play. Here it's probably a bit more useful because it's specific to this game and this game world, as well as the more generic advice. And some scenario suggestions. Another thing more people need to put in their books. Adventure seeds and hooks. I do when I remember. And then a sample adventure. Now that does, however, always feel like wasted space in a book. Unfortunately, because you're only ever going to use it once. I'd much rather put it as separate, maybe cheap. And an index, something else people leave out, and okay, so you can see the depth of the background and so on, because you've got a background sheet and a character sheet that stretches over two, and then you've got a specialist chiromancer sheet. So yeah, you can see that the background information, the background data and everything, it goes into depth. So if you want a strong character-led game, it's great for that. Now that's Tales of Gargentihr. Maybe I'll see if I can look the guys up again and see if they'd be interested in letting me do a new edition. We shall see. Zang.
I'm so nasty, I'm so greedy, I'm so lonesome, girl, I'm so needy. I wanna take you, make you my girl.
This is horrible what happened today. See, I don't like I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot. You know? But I hate with style and creativity. Yeah!